At my daughter's wedding, after paying for every flower and light, she looked past me, said it was immediate family only, and the coordinator asked me to leave. I set down the small gift I had wrapped myself, my work-rough hands remembering bedtime stories while marble floors gleamed under a chandelier I had quietly paid to keep shining. Emily, coached by Michael's smile, called it image and class, and guests politely pretended not to listen while my love was reframed as favoritism and an embarrassment to manage. I swallowed the hurt, then drew a straight line with contracts, timestamps, and receipts, stopping payments, calling vendors, and preparing proof to snap their perfect picture back into honest focus. When family reduces you to a prop in a room you funded, will you step aside or stand up and reclaim your dignity with truth and consequences? My name is Thomas Reed, 63, retired, a father who served stateside. Years of checklists taught me to breathe, scan entrances, and hold steady. I arrived early at the ballroom carrying a carefully wrapped gift box. The marble floor shone like water under a chandelier strewing quiet rainbows. White roses perfumed the air, louder than the quartet easing through rehearsal. Emily stood near the entrance in the dress I paid for entirely. Michael hovered beside her, polished smile set, attention fixed on watching eyes. The coordinator scanned a tablet and asked my name without lifting her gaze. I told her calmly and waited while she checked the master list. She swallowed once, then said I wasn't cleared for the celebration. Emily glanced at guests and said this was immediate family only, today. The word only did more damage than any raised voice ever could. I kept my shoulders level and asked if congratulations might be appropriate. Michael answered smoothly that appearances mattered, and certain circles prized discretion over sentiment. Several men pretended to adjust cufflinks while listening, the way hunters listen. A photographer lowered his camera as if he expected something worth selling. I saw my daughter's shoulders stiffen, then soften when no one applauded. She said she appreciated everything, but today required the right kind of image. The sentence landed like ice water, precise and cold across my chest. I placed the gift box on the table beside untouched champagne flutes. The ribbon looked too bright under lights built to flatter wealth more kindly. I had signed every check, yet my name did not belong here. A server slipped past me silently, careful not to brush my sleeve. I thought of braces, school plays, and nights reading until she slept. Back then, she asked for another story and curled against my side. I told myself this moment was about respect, not rooms or roses. The coordinator offered a practiced smile that never touched the eyes watching. Emily asked me softly not to create a scene that would linger. Michael thanked me for understanding how fragile big days could become under pressure. I nodded once and kept my voice steady, because practice becomes habit. During service years, I learned to step back before stepping forward again. I chose to step back and spare her public pain this time. My boots clicked softly on marble that never knew dirt under nails. A guest laughed too loudly, the kind of laugh money forgives on cue. I felt eyes slide away, like doors closing in slow, practiced rhythm. The cool air outside smelled honest, like rain pushing dust from heat. Luxury cars lined the entrance, polished like mirrors expecting approval from strangers. My pickup waited farther out where the asphalt cracked and weeds survived. I set the gift on the passenger seat and watched my hands. They were steady, the way they stayed steady before difficult conversations. A habit remained: count breaths, note exits, decide without drama. I checked the time, then checked the quiet, then checked my resolve. Inside, the quartet shifted into something bright that never touched the ground. I imagined the florist balancing orchids against columns built to impress donors. The picture was perfect if you ignored who kept the lights on. I had kept them on for years without asking anyone for thanks. Still standing there, I felt like a contractor dismissed after finishing foundations. The thought tightened my throat, the way cold tightens wet rope. I could have argued, waived receipts, and demanded recognition before their friends. That would have satisfied pride and left her smaller in public view. I chose silence, because silence sometimes teaches louder than any speech can. The engine started, and the radio offered news that did not matter. I looked back once at the doors and felt something important shift. If my presence meant nothing inside, what value did it still hold? I sat in the truck and let the anger cool into purpose. Years of checklists steadied my breathing as I unlocked the phone. The bank's hotline rang once before a woman answered with a careful tone. I gave my name, my account, and the phrases that open guarded doors. She asked for verification and read back today's largest pending transactions. I confirmed each vendor by category, not by blame, because blame wastes time. She warned me about fees and fallout, then asked if I was certain. I said certainty was the point, and she began processing stop payments immediately. While she worked, I studied the ballroom windows reflecting a thin gray sky. Men in suits drifted like schools of fish, avoiding anything that smelled difficult. Emily's silhouette moved among them with practiced grace I had once encouraged. The banker returned with codes and timestamps, her voice steady, her language exact. I wrote every number into a small field notebook I still carried. Old habits survive retirement. Pen left, phone right, decisions recorded before emotion returns. We ended the call with a professional politeness that left no air for doubt. I scrolled to catering and found the number that matched the contracted invoice. The manager answered with bright confidence and background clatter, then asked if everything pleased us. I told him authorization had been revoked at the source and assets needed protection. He tried to turn charm into leverage, then shifted to policy once he heard liability. He said he would verify, then I heard his breath tighten and his tone drop. He thanked me for the warning and said his team was on its way. I wrote down his name, the time, and 3 tasks he promised to execute. The florist answered on the second ring and said the orchids looked breathtaking under chandeliers. I told her payments were void and removal was permissible under the signed agreement. She went silent for a beat, then asked if this was personal punishment. I said it was a business correction to end a pattern that harmed everyone. She said her crew would approach discreetly and preserve what could be reused. I made space for gratitude in my voice, because dignity helps work. Move cleanly. Music and AV took longer because the coordinator was juggling multiple events across town. I explained the stopped authorizations and cited the clause for immediate equipment retrieval. He said engineers would arrive with cases, power down safely, and pull cables fast. The photographer listened without speaking, then asked if access to images was restricted. I told him he owned his work until payment cleared and should secure everything. He said he understood and would speak only through the contract from this moment. Linens and rentals were straightforward because the invoice language was painfully clear already. They promised a supervisor and 2 trucks within the hour, plus an inventory specialist. Between calls, I watched those windows and remembered bracing winter mornings at job sites. We poured foundations before daylight because schedules, like integrity, slip if you let them. Inside, glasses lifted and lowered in patterns that meant nothing outside that room. I could almost hear the quartet smoothing edges that would not stay smooth. A memory surfaced. Emily at 8 counting carpentry nails in tidy 10s before dinner. Back then, her order came from wanting to help, not to impress anyone. I set that memory beside the present and let its weight settle evenly. Then I called the venue office and asked for the manager who signed contracts. She answered quickly and tried to manage me with hospitality, not accountability. I told her the payments came from one source now formally withdrawn across the board. She asked if we could discuss after the celebration to avoid distressing important families. I said the most important person to protect was already excluded at the door. She asked for documentation, and I read the bank codes in careful succession. She said she would confirm with accounting and adjust access accordingly, including overnight privileges. I thanked her for following policy and ended the call before regret could argue. The phone buzzed with Emily's name and a photo from her graduation day. I watched the screen until it faded, then wrote a single word beside the time. Boundary. A second call followed immediately, and I let that one pass too. I pictured her face when the first vendor approached and felt my jaw tighten. This was not revenge, I reminded myself, but course correction after years of drift. I called my attorney's office and left a brief message with reception. I said I needed a Monday consult about converting informal support into documented obligations. The receptionist asked for a summary, and I offered only dates, totals, and names. She said the partner would review and call first thing, no small talk added. I closed the phone and opened the thinner of 2 glove box ledgers. On the first page, I wrote a clean header with today's date and location. Under it, I listed each vendor, contract clause, and expected action before sundown. The page looked like a range card for a different kind of field exercise. That kind of order kept me calm when weather shifted and plans got loud. I looked up and saw a white van turn off the boulevard toward the service lane. The logo showed 3 pale flowers curved like commas in a whispered sentence. Another vehicle followed, a low truck with covered racks meant for warm food. In the window, a ripple moved through guests the way wind moves tall grass. I watched a bridesmaid lean toward Emily and then glance toward the side doors. Michael's shoulders squared when the coordinator touched his sleeve and tipped her head. He began moving before she finished whatever sentence she had practiced for emergencies. My phone vibrated against the console, and I let it travel unanswered once more. I breathed in the quiet of the cab and held it a moment longer. It was not triumph, I felt, but the clean relief of a straight line. I remembered teaching young hires to square a layout before you set your first stake. If the line is true, everything that follows finds the right weight. I noted the time again because timestamps matter when stories get rewritten later. A third van turned in with rolling cases and 2 staff in black shirts. The driver checked the address twice, then pointed toward the alley entrance and reversed. I pictured a neat conversation at a loading door. Policy, signature, and route back. Inside, someone would object loudly, then find the clause that settled the noise. I thought of how often I had paid to keep such scenes invisible. Quiet money had hidden the cost of appearances more times than I admitted. That ended today, not to humiliate her, but to end the hiding altogether. The phone lit again with my daughter's name, and I kept my hands still. I let the ring finish, then wrote a second word beside the first entry. Terms. A gust moved leaves along the curb and sent a small paper cup skittering. The ballroom music shifted key and tempo, then steadied as if coached. I could not hear words, but I knew the tone of apologies offered too late. The first vendor van stopped near the service door and idled with patient purpose. Crew stepped out with bins and tape, and that focused look workers share everywhere. One of them lifted his chin toward the door, then reached for the handle. And the next part was about to begin. Through the windshield, I watched the florist step inside with quiet purpose, while 2 assistants carried empty bins like lifeboats through calm water before a storm. Guests noticed first with tilted heads and paused conversations, then with mouths set too straight as centerpieces lost height and color. A bridesmaid moved to intercept and pointed toward Emily with a tight smile that asked for discretion and mercy in the same breath. The florist kept her tone low and businesslike, showing a printed clause and the fresh bank codes I had already read aloud. A ripple crossed the room when the main altarpiece came down in careful sections. The quartet softened to background air as the AV techs arrived at the side door with wheeled cases, eyes scanning cables the way workers scan fault lines. I watched them power down, coil leads, and label each coil with tape pulled clean and fast. The caterer came next and lifted stainless lids, then covered trays with white cloth like snow falling on summer grass. A supervisor traced inventory with a pen, while 2 servers boxed canapes that never learned the names on place cards. The venue manager appeared and spoke to Emily with formal calm while keeping her hands still at her sides. Michael squared his shoulders and tried to direct traffic with the confidence of someone who thinks rules are favors. He gestured toward the musicians and the florist as if authority could be willed into the air. The manager answered with policy and a practiced nod toward the accounting office, then looked past him as if awaiting confirmation that had already arrived. I saw the moment Emily understood the source because her eyes went to the door and held there as if I might materialize and make it gentle. I stayed in the cab because distance kept me from saying too much. A server stepped outside for air and lit a cigarette she did not smoke. then watched the florist carry a bundle of white orchids that looked like surrendered flags. The photographer packed bodies and lenses with the fast care of a medic under light fire, then spoke briefly with the coordinator before turning toward the exit. A guest in a silver dress tried to complain, then buried the complaint in a new complaint about parking, then decided to check on a sitter. Men in suits made phone calls that went nowhere because the problem was not a phone problem. The music stopped fully when the last channel muted, and the room sounded like carpet-swallowing footsteps. I wrote the time and the word verified because verified means less room for later stories. My phone vibrated with a message from the attorney's office confirming a Monday morning slot with the senior partner. I answered with 3 lines, scope, totals, and requested remedies, and closed the thread before anger could dress itself as eloquence. The florist crew returned with empty bins, then with full ones, then with a final glance back at a room that now looked like a stage between shows. The caterer's truck eased away, followed by the van with rolling cases, followed by a smaller car carrying the photographer who checked mirrors twice, like a man leaving weather behind. I waited until the service door closed and the manager stood there alone, rubbing the edge of her tablet with a thumb, the way people rub rosary beads without realizing it. I started the engine and drove past the portico slowly enough to see Emily hold herself tall without a surface to lean on. She pressed a hand against her dress as if to keep fabric from floating away. Michael spoke into his phone and used his free hand to steady an expression that did not want to be steady. I did not wave, because waving would have been cruel. I reached home with daylight left and placed the gift box on my dining table. The ribbon still looked too bright under light that had earned itself by keeping bills paid on time. I opened a filing drawer and pulled the first binder labeled Education with ink that had not faded. I set up a fresh spreadsheet and entered headings that turned years into rows. The numbers did not accuse, they clarified. Tuition stacked beside dorm costs, then transportation, then monthlies that had become seasonal traditions disguised as emergencies. I wrote without hurry and let each figure cool before the next one warmed my hands. When the totals settled into their columns, I added a narrow field for notes that only I would read. It held words like braces, tire, spring brake, and storm door, and it steadied me more than the sum at the bottom could manage. I slept lightly and woke before dawn, a habit from old field briefings that never fully left my bones. Monday arrived with a partner in a quiet office who spoke in sentences engineered for results. She read the summary, asked for sequence, and requested supporting proofs by category with timestamps. I provided what I had prepared and accepted a packet with 3 options printed in clean, inevitable language. The plan was not punishment, it was correction. A formal demand would require acknowledgement of debt, a 30-day window, and a structured path to resolve without spectacle if reason held. If reason did not hold, the next steps would move forward in a venue that respected paper more than noise. We agreed on tone, scope, and schedule. Then we signed our names like adults trying to keep a family from becoming a headline. By afternoon, the papers were prepared with timelines and attachments, and a courier carried them away, with the kind of care decent people use when the box feels heavier than it looks. I returned to the office and reviewed bids, while the crew foreman texted a photo of rebar, tied perfectly square against morning frost. Work heals what pride tears open, because work gives you something true to hold. Near evening, the first stones arrived on the water. A cousin forwarded a post framed in soft outrage where feelings replaced facts and strangers rushed to be kind without checking the bill. The story bent the night into a shape where a father became a villain for refusing to fund a fantasy that had already used up its shelter. Comments multiplied, then called other comments, then reached small circles that pretend to be big when you stare too long. A reporter left a polite voicemail asking for my view before filing a piece that would almost surely be wrong if I stayed silent. The old me might have let it blow over and waited for weather. The disciplined me recognized a different duty. Truth is a tool, and tools are meant to be used. I gathered the documentation into a single, simple narrative, organized like a project timeline from first day to present hour. I redacted numbers that did not belong in public and exposed numbers that explained everything that mattered. I called the partner and asked for a measured statement that aligned with contracts and obligations rather than anger. She agreed to attend and keep me inside the line where dignity lives. We scheduled a press availability for the next morning in a modest conference room that smelled like coffee and toner and honest deadlines. I slept better than expected and arrived early enough to read the room before it filled. A small crowd assembled with notebooks and cameras that looked bigger than the questions they usually catch. I stood straight and spoke plainly because plain words carry farther than sharp ones when they meet quiet hearts. I explained that years of support had been offered freely until support turned into expectation without gratitude or responsibility. I laid out the spend in categories any working family would understand, then showed proof of payments tied to dates and services without a single flourish. I emphasized this was not revenge, but the end of an arrangement that had failed the person it was meant to help. A reporter asked if I felt shame about the wedding interruption, and I answered that I felt grief that it became necessary after other options were ignored. Another asked if I would withdraw the demand if apologies arrived. I said apologies matter, but growth matters more, and growth begins with owning costs. I referenced service once because those years taught me how to separate feelings from orders when lives depend on clarity. Lives did not depend on this, but futures did. We finished cleanly and provided copies for those who wanted to read instead of react. The first hour afterward was quiet in that heavy way. Good rain quiets a street. Then the calls changed tone. Partners from long projects called to say the numbers told a story they recognized. Neighbors said the timeline sounded like something their fathers would have understood without needing paperwork. The reporter who left the polite voicemail wrote a piece that centered the documents, and let the documents carry the weight normal words cannot carry alone. The tide turned, not because I argued better, but because the truth felt familiar to people who keep their own lights on. Meanwhile, the public story Emily had crafted began to fray where it rubbed against receipts. Polite sympathies softened into polite questions, and questions pulled at threads until the shape loosened. A community group that prides itself on appearing generous reposted my chart with a caption about responsibility, spoken so gently, it hurt. Michael's circle tried to frame the matter as a misunderstanding, until the math refused to bend under friendship. The venue manager confirmed procedure and policy in a brief note that no one could twist. The florist posted a neutral explanation about asset recovery that read like a weather report. The caterer simply confirmed service ceased when authorization ceased, then went back to work. The more the noise tried to rise, the more it sounded like weather again. Late in the day, I drove to the site and walked the edges where foundations would soon harden into lines people trust without thinking. The foreman pointed to a correction near the northwest corner where the string had shifted, and someone caught it early. We both looked at the small fix and understood the large expense it prevented. He asked if everything at home was manageable, and I said it was under review with better boundaries this time. On the way back, I passed the hotel that rents rooms by the week to traveling salespeople and families between places. I thought of how many times a restart looks like failure to those who never needed one. At home, the gift box still sat where I had left it, a small white square with ribbon set like a question I had not answered. I untied the bow and lifted the lid and looked at the letter I had written last week and decided not to include. It was not a speech, only a page that remembered a swing set and a spelling bee, and a tired man reading 3 stories because a little girl asked nicely. I read the lines once and slid the page under the ledger as if to say memory would not be used as currency anymore. The phone buzzed with a message that Emily had received the documents by courier with her signature recorded cleanly. Another message followed from a friend of hers who once worked summers on our cruise and thanked me for telling the story, without spite. The evening news ran a short segment that showed charts instead of faces, and ended with a sentence about boundaries sounding like kindness when they arrive before damage is permanent. I stood at the window and watched porch lights blink on down the street as neighbors cooked dinner and called children inside. The victory did not feel like victory, It felt like gravity returning to a room that had been floating for years. I knew there would be fallout, because nothing this public lands without cracks. There would be new costs that could not be paid in cash, and new distances that might not close again. I placed the lid back on the box and turned off the kitchen light, and told myself a truth I could live with. Order protects love when love forgets how to protect itself. Then I asked the only question that mattered before sleep found me. What price will this order ask me to pay tomorrow? Morning came quiet and exact, the way cold air clears a fogged mind, and the price of yesterday arrived on every screen before I finished my coffee. Messages stacked into small mountains made of worry and opinions, then toppled as new ones landed with second-hand outrage that forgot to check receipts. A contractor canceled a breakfast and rescheduled for Thursday because his wife wanted a day before appearing in photos beside me at the Rotary. I told him Thursday was fine and meant it because steadiness beats speed when crowds are loud. Around 10, a text from an old foreman simply said he had my back because the work was always straight, and so were the books. I kept my phone on the counter while I checked invoices and circled 3 that needed calls about materials arriving late, because weather had bullied the highway again. When the phone rang, the name on the glass tightened my chest like a belt pulled 1 notch too far. I answered on the 4th ring and said her name the way men say a prayer without making a show of it. Emily asked if I had a few minutes because her day had emptied faster than the night emptied the ballroom. She said the hotel would need a card before noon, or the desk would set her things aside with a note that sounded helpful, but wasn't. I asked where Michael was, and she paused long enough to tell the truth without defending it. He was home with his family, fixing the shape of his future, and explaining why a crisis had surprised him on his first week as a husband. She said his mother was kind in a way that did not include money, and his father was direct in a way that did not include staying married through scandals that did not belong to their household. The quiet after that sentence held more weight than scolding ever holds. I told her I would meet her at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hotel, because public places help people keep their voices inside a decent range. She said thank you with a softness I had not heard in years, and promised to be there in 10 minutes with a notebook and a pen she had borrowed from the front desk. I arrived first and chose a table that saw the door without broadcasting itself, the way men on job sites choose a spot, near shade and water. She came in with yesterday's makeup and today's humility, then sat down and folded her hands like she was waiting for an exam to start. I placed a small index card on the table and wrote 1 word in the top corner where I had written it before: terms. I said I would help her for 7 days so she could breathe and find footing, not to make the fall softer, but to keep broken bones from slowing the work ahead. I said she would find any job within 2 weeks and keep it for 6 months without asking me for more money even once. I said she would call me every Sunday evening with proof of hours worked and progress toward paying small debts she could touch with her hands. I said apologies were welcome, but consistency was the only currency that cleared this account. She nodded faster than the words allowed, then slowed down and asked if I believed she could do it, or if I just needed to say it to live with myself. I told her belief was not the question anymore, and that trust grows like concrete cures, slowly, in the right conditions, and ruined by shortcuts. She closed her eyes for a beat and said she understood, and that she would understand again tomorrow when it felt less clear than it did now. I slid the card toward her with the 7-day number written under the word terms, then transferred $1,000 while she watched the screen change, because ritual teaches the body what the mind keeps trying to forget. She asked what to do first, and I said eat something, then walk to the diner on 4th that always needed a host with a calm voice at lunch, then ask for the manager and offer to start today if they would take her. She asked if I would walk with her, and I said no, because this had to be her weight to lift. She looked toward the window as if a different father might be reflected there, then looked back and said that made sense, and asked if I would wait here until she returned with an answer. I said I would give her an hour and then leave to make a site visit because work still needed daylight. She stood, hesitated, and then asked if I kept the gift box from yesterday because she realized she had never opened it. I said I had, and that it held something I had decided to keep until the right time, because timing matters more than content when a heart is raw. She went to the counter, ordered a sandwich she could afford now, and walked out with steps that learned something about pace from kitchens and long hallways. I sipped coffee and wrote a new list in my small notebook. Her week, my week, the thin bridge between them that could hold if we placed boards with care. The hour stretched and then breathed again when she pushed through the door with a new name tag, pinned crooked to a blouse that had seen better irons. She said the manager needed someone at the front until 2, then needed rolled silverware until 4, and could offer 20 hours this week if she did not disappear at the first rush. She smiled with the kind of smile that knows it is not yet a victory. I told her I was proud of the ask, not the hours, and that the hours would grow if the ask kept showing up. She said she would check in after the shift and left with her shoulders 1 inch higher than before. I drove to the site and found the crew laughing about nothing important while they moved heavy things safely, which is how crews stay human under steel. Dave walked me along the forms and pointed to a clean fix at the northwest corner that saved $1,000 and a lost day. I told him good eye, and meant it because praise should land on paper, not just air. He asked gently if family fires were under control, and I said they were contained, which is the best you can say when wind still moves. In the afternoon, messages arrived from people who had believed Emily's first story, and now believed something else, because numbers tell a steadier tale than tears online. One message came from Michael, careful and formal, asking if we might speak about reputations and next steps that minimized collateral damage. I declined the conversation and suggested he speak with his parents about the difference between image and character, then left it alone, because some lessons belong to other houses. That night, Emily called from her small room with the tight bed and the louder air unit and described learning the diner till, the table numbers, and the pace of politeness that stays polite even when guests bring their worst day to your station. She said a woman left a note beside a few dollars that thanked her for looking right at her when she ordered, and the note felt larger than the money, in a way she had not expected. I told her those moments build lives if you let them, and asked what her hours were tomorrow. She said 11 to 6 with a break that might happen, and promised to send a photo of the schedule, because proof helps when doubt returns late. For a week we spoke each night, and measured hours like a metronome, holding frightened hands steady enough to practice. She returned the index card by sending a photo of it taped above her desk, where she would see it each morning, before remembering other things. On Thursday, a post from her changed the current in a quiet way that mattered to those who matter. She wrote that she had hurt someone who did not deserve it, and that she was working to repair what could be repaired, starting with her own habits. She did not name me and did not perform regret for applause. She simply stated new boundaries and let silence do its work. The comments turned from drama into regular advice about shoes that survive long shifts and meals you can carry in a coat pocket. Michael's mother wrote a public line that said she wished everyone well and believed good families find their shape by telling the truth early. It was a statement designed to look generous and land precise, and it told me she was exiting the stage without admitting her earlier pressure. I chose not to answer because dignity also knows when to be quiet. On Sunday evening, Emily arrived at my house exactly on time, with a receipt folder she had bought for $3 and a schedule printed in black and white. She asked if she could sit at the kitchen table, and I said yes, because that table had held more storms than this one, and never failed to dry by morning. She laid out her cash tips, her pay stub, and a list of expenses that made sense, and did not ask for more than the week's envelope could carry. I watched her hands move over the paper, and saw the 8-year-old who sorted nails into tidy 10s without anyone asking. She caught me seeing it, and looked away for a second, then back, then asked if I remembered the swing she had begged me to push higher, because the sky looked closer from that angle. I said I remembered, and that she had laughed like she trusted gravity to return her safely. She said she wanted that laugh back without taking shortcuts this time. I told her it would come when she had enough days stacked straight to carry weight without bending. She reached into her bag and placed two $20 bills on the table and said this was the first repayment, not because it mattered to the total, but because beginnings matter to the person who needs them most. I slid the bills back and said she should keep them for shoes that would protect her back, then added that future payments would go straight to a separate account with her name on it and my oversight until the balances stopped whispering at night. She nodded and did not argue, because arguing would have been about pride, not progress. We set the next week's plan with small goals that could survive noise: 2 more shifts, 1 application at a grocery, and a call to the community college about a short bookkeeping course that might suit her eye for order. She said thank you in a voice that did not beg and did not flatter, just landed square on the table between us. After she left, I opened the gift box one more time and read the letter I had written before the wedding, when I believed speeches could carry fragile things across crowded rooms. It remembered a night she spelled a hard word, right because she paused, breathed, and trusted what she knew. It asked her to build a life that honored the work behind every quiet comfort. I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope and wrote her name on it with the same pen I use for site changes, because ink reminds me that paper becomes history faster than memory does. I slipped the envelope into a drawer labeled Family, then closed it gently and went to bed without checking my phone. In the days that followed, some business cooled and then returned with a firmer handshake, while other business wandered off toward newer stories without saying goodbye. That was fine, because not all clients belong to your future, and not all friends know how to stay when your answers stop pleasing them. Emily's hours climbed to 30 and then 34, and she sent a photo of new shoes that looked like they could carry truth for miles. She learned to balance 3 plates without clatter, and to read a table's weather before stepping into it, and she learned to take correction without folding into herself. Once, a guest from the wedding recognized her and raised an eyebrow. In that way people raise prices in their head, and Emily answered with steady service and moved on without bleeding. She called that night and said it felt like walking past a mirror that once told lies, and I said mirrors stop lying when you stop asking them for anything but the surface. One afternoon, Michael texted a proposal about an annulment that would keep his family's name immaculate on paper and leave hers at the mercy of rumor. I recommended a lawyer who specialized in simple truth and told her to let professionals translate fear into clean sentences. She met with the lawyer, signed what needed signing, and walked out lighter in a way the scale could not register. On a quiet Friday, after a week that behaved, she asked if we could meet at the coffee shop again because she had something to hand back. She arrived with the index card and a second card she had made herself with the same word at the top: terms. Under it, she had written her own rules: no debt she could not pay by month's end, no purchases to impress people with short memories, and 1 hour each week to help someone else without telling anyone online about it. She slid the card across and waited, not for praise, but for a nod that meant the beam was true. I nodded and tucked it into the notebook beside mine, because matching tools make shared work easier. Before we stood, she asked if the letter in the box was ready yet, and her eyes held steady enough to take no for an answer. I told her soon, which was more honest than yes, and kinder than later. She smiled a small, earned smile, then went to her shift and left the doorbell chime hanging like a clean note in clear air. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the street settle into the hour when parents call kids home and porch lights come on without being asked. The house felt the way a site feels after forms are stripped, plain, strong, waiting for the next layers to arrive at their right time. I thought about the first day in the ballroom and the last day at the coffee shop and recognized the line between them as the same line I draw in chalk before a crew shows up with steel and hope. The price of victory had not been money or face. It had been letting silence do some talking while action rebuilt what speeches never could. I held the sealed letter and weighed it in my hand and asked myself whether opening old tenderness would help the new structure, or whether it would only tempt us back toward rooms where appearances pick the music and people forget who paid for the lights. And if I gave her that page now, would it anchor her growth or loosen it? Spring settled into the kind of weather that makes sidewalks look freshly swept, and the pace of our days found a rhythm that did not ask for applause. Emily worked her shifts and sent photos of schedules taped above the little desk, then called on Sundays with a voice that carried fatigue and something steadier. She tracked hours in a small ledger and marked tips with tiny stars when guests left notes that felt larger than numbers. She began the bookkeeping class on Tuesday nights and texted me a picture of a spreadsheet with columns that lined up like fence posts after a good rain. I read the image twice and felt the quiet relief that arrives when a bridge holds its weight without groaning. We did not discuss the wedding anymore, because some rooms close to keep the rest of the house livable. We discussed shoes that guard the back, meals that travel well, and sleep that returns when your day has clean edges. Michael's name stopped appearing on the phone, and then stopped appearing in thought, which is how seasons change when you keep working. Community talk cooled into something ordinary, where people nod and move on, because the story no longer feeds them. Business recovered in the shape it wanted, not the shape I once pursued, and I let it choose its own height and width without argument. One afternoon, I stopped by the diner near 3 and sat where I could see the door without advertising it. Emily moved through the room with the kind of calm that lifts service out of apology and into competence. She greeted a couple with weather and water, then helped a dishwasher who had fallen behind without announcing the favor to anyone. When she saw me, she did not wave. She finished a table properly, then came by with a smile that looked earned rather than borrowed. She said the shift was light, and the manager liked how she handled rushes without chasing chatter. She said the bookkeeping instructor had praised her column discipline and suggested an entry-level position in a small office once the course ended. I told her those comments sounded like beams passing inspection, and asked how the shoes were holding up. She tapped a heel against tile and said the new pair had saved her knees. A family slid into the booth behind me, and a child laughed, the bright, unguarded kind that evaporates strain better than speeches. Emily refilled waters, crossed the room twice, and returned with a folded receipt that showed a week without missed hours. She said the budget had held, and the envelope still had air inside on Saturday night. I nodded and let the quiet say what words would have crowded. Weeks stitched themselves into a pattern that felt like a life rather than a plan. And then the class finished on a mild evening with a certificate printed on heavy paper. Emily asked if I could meet her outside the community college after work, because the room would be crowded and she did not want to make a show. I parked under a tired maple and watched students carry small victories to cars that looked like they had waited without complaint. She came out with the paper clipped to a folder and the same determined walk I had seen when she was 8 and wanted one more push toward the sky. She said the instructor had mentioned a part-time opening at a local contractor who needed help reconciling invoices and tracking materials. She said she had already sent a resume without my name on it and felt strangely proud of that choice. I told her that sounded exactly right and asked what help she needed next. She said she needed time, not money, and a steady reminder to keep column lines true when numbers began to blur under long weeks. I said we could handle that, and we stood in the soft light with 2 cars between us, like people who understood distance without dramatizing it. The first repayment arrived on a Monday in an envelope she handed me without ceremony. It was small because small was correct, and it was timely because timeliness builds trust better than size. I logged it into the ledger with the same neat hand I used on site changes and handed her a photocopy for her folder. She looked at the copy and smiled like a person who sees stairs instead of a cliff. She asked if we could schedule an evening each month for side-by-side books, so mistakes became lessons before they became weight. I agreed and suggested the second Thursday at 7 because fixed times keep good intentions from drifting. She wrote it on an index card, labeled terms, and set the card between us, like a rule that honored both names. We did not revisit the old totals that night because history had been counted and filed already. We spent the hour discussing a grocery budget that made sense, a bus route that saved gas, and a simple meal plan that protected mornings from becoming emergencies. On a clear Saturday, she invited me to sit at the diner's counter and try the soup the cook insisted was his best work. I arrived after the lunch rush and saw her training a new host with patient gestures and quiet course corrections. She moved like someone who trusts muscle memory and mental checklists rather than mood. A couple from the wedding walked in and paused, as if time had stepped too close, then took a table and became customers like everyone else because the roles had changed. Emily served them steadily, used the same words she used for strangers, and did not look toward me for approval. After they left, she took a minute beside the soda machine and breathed the way I taught young hires to breathe when the first day hits hard. She came back to the counter and said it felt like passing a test she had not studied for, and she understood that preparation looks like showing up so often the test stops being special. I told her that sounded true, and let the spoon knock the bowl gently like a little hammer testing a beam. 3 months after the coffee shop terms, she brought 2 envelopes and placed them on the kitchen table I had polished that morning. The first held the next payment, and the second held receipts, and a written summary with numbers that matched without needing correction. She said the office job had started at 20 hours and would rise to 30 if she kept deadlines clean. She said the manager appreciated that she asked questions early and fixed mistakes without explaining them away. I told her questions save money when they arrive before concrete hardens, and she laughed softly at how many metaphors in my life start with forms and lines. We talked about a modest 1-bedroom available near the bus line, and she asked if I would review the lease with her before she signed. I agreed and suggested she negotiate for fresh paint and a discount on the first month if she moved midweek. She took notes, underlined move midweek twice, and said she would ask without apologizing for asking. On a quiet Thursday, she knocked on my door carrying the white gift box that had sat on my table for months. She set it down like a shared weight, finally ready to change shape, and asked if the letter inside was ready for its job. I told her it was, and that I had added 1 sentence last week after watching her help a coworker through a rush without being asked. She opened the box, lifted the envelope, and read standing up because sitting would have made the moment softer than it needed to be. The letter remembered small things that money never bought: a spelling bee, a swing, a night of 3 stories when sleep would not come. It asked her to guard those memories as evidence of who she was before rooms with chandeliers taught her to perform. It ended with a single line about dignity being a limit held quietly, not a favor begged loudly. She finished, breathed once, and said the sentence landed exactly where it should. She folded the page carefully and returned it to the envelope, and then to the box, as if to say the words would live elsewhere now. Later that month, we signed a simple agreement that replaced the legal demand with a structured plan built on what she was already doing. It acknowledged the debt, set payments that honored reality, and established review points where success could lighten terms. It also stated clearly that interruptions, manipulations, or public campaigns would void the plan and return us to the cold path we had survived. She read the document twice and asked intelligent questions without flinching, then signed with a pen that did not shake. We put the agreement in the family drawer and closed it with the quiet of people who prefer function to theater. We walked to the porch and watched a storm move in from the west, the kind that cleans dust from windows and teaches roofs what they were built to do. She asked if I ever missed the old days before boundaries, and I said I missed the innocence that believed gifts could do the work of character. She stood beside me and said she understood now that character is work by another name, and that work would be hers to carry from here. A letter arrived from the venue months later with a generic invitation to a charity gala that did not know its own history. I placed it in the recycle bin and smiled at the way paper forgets where it has been. I spent that evening at the job site instead, watching lights glow against newly poured slabs that would hold families and offices without needing thanks. Dave walked the line with me and said the crew had started quoting my sayings back to me, which meant the culture had settled into its bones. I told him sayings are just reminders to do what you already know, then wrote a small note about a drainage detail that would save a headache in spring. On my way home, I stopped by the diner and left cash for the staff to split, not as a gesture, but because nights live easier when someone sees you working. On the first Sunday of summer, We met again at the coffee shop, where the index card had set the first line straight. Emily arrived on time with a different posture, one that belonged to a woman who trusts the floor under her shoes. She handed me another payment and a small card she had written for herself with the words, "Keep showing up," printed at the top. She said the office had offered her a full-time position starting next month and a chance to assist with project bids if she completed a second course. She asked if I thought she could handle it, and I said capacity grows in the same direction as honesty, which is to say forward. She nodded and looked out the window at people walking nowhere in particular, because Sundays can be gentle when you earn them. We stood to leave, and she asked one last question with a voice that did not tremble. She asked if I would come to dinner next month after she moved into the new place, not for a celebration, but for a simple meal where work clothes were welcome and stories were small. I said yes because yes fit inside the limits we had built, and because dinners taste better when no one is grating the table. We walked to our cars, and she laughed once. The old laugh folded into the new one, then waved without performance. I drove home with the window down and the air warm on my arm, and I thought about how much of love is simply refusing to lie to it. The house waited quietly, steady and ordinary, and I sat at the table where the white box had taught both of us something clear. Justice had done its work without becoming revenge, and respect had returned by taking the long way back. I opened the ledger and made a final note for the day. Payment received, plan on track, dignity intact. Then I closed the book and let the quiet have the room. Because quiet, when it is earned, is the sweetest sound a home can make.